So this is the Nikon Z8. So you can think of it basically like a baby Z9 with a few new features that make for an excellent offering in the Nikon Z system. So like the Z9, the Z8 has no mechanical shutter. It offers a 45.7 megapixel stacked full-frame sensor with blackout-free shooting. The Z8 also supports burst speed shooting up to 20 frames per second in RAW, or in JPEG you have the option of 30 frames a second or even 120 frames a second. The camera's video specs support up to 8K 60p or 4K 120p in the same impressive variety of options found in the Z9, including H.265, ProRes, Inlog, as well as the ProRes and Inlog RAW options. The camera features the same AI-driven autofocus, updating 120 times a second in continuous modes, and actually gives us a new airplane algorithm. The Z8 is an impressive offering that in many ways it does mirror the Z9, except in a smaller form factor, and best of all, it's at a lower price. Welcome back, everyone. In this video, we're going to be talking about the brand new Nikon Z8, which I had exactly one day to do some shooting with, but I do want to thank Nikon for making that possible. And in this video, I want to give some of my first impressions, share some of my thoughts, and talk about some pros and cons on this camera. It's actually very impressive, so let's dig in. So for the most part, this camera is indeed a much smaller version of the Z9, but there's a few differences, so let's go ahead and start there. So obviously the body is much smaller, which is going to give a serious camera option to photographers who like smaller bodies. It's not quite as compact as the Z6 or Z7, however. I feel like in many ways the form on this camera is more of a return to the D850 in its design and its handling. I actually think this is a good move on Nikon's part because there are many long-term Nikon users who are going to welcome this, and honestly, it's a form that Nikon has done so well for many years that just makes sense. One of the great design strengths of Nikon is consistency in their operation over the entire product lineup, and this one feels the most like a DSLR out of the 5 full-frame mirrorless cameras that Nikon has released to date. It's slightly smaller than a DSLR, of course, but my best comparison is to say that the body and ergonomics definitely give a nod to shooters who are going to prefer this type of style. There are a few new features on the Z8, and so let's start with the 2 USB ports. So on the side of the camera, you're going to see the dual USB-C ports that allow pro photographers the option of using power delivery and data transfer at the same time with these 2 dedicated connections. This is kind of a niche feature in some ways, but it establishes the Z8 as a serious option for professionals who do need this. Another new feature that I'm really excited about is now we have 2 tone modes that work with shooting RAW stills. This is really cool, and it's an idea that's borrowed from video, where we have standard dynamic range footage, or we might have HLG footage. Well, now we can do that with RAW stills. So SDR stands for standard dynamic range, HLG stands for hybrid log gamma. So the idea is that with a hybrid log gamma, you have a much wider dynamic range that you're shooting with. This allows you to capture much more detail in highlight areas as well as shadowed areas. And so the idea is that even if you're outputting to a standard color space, so something like if you're printing or going to JPEG, you'll be able to take advantage of that in your edit and you won't lose detail. So the way this works is when you select the HLG tone mode, the base ISO of the camera is no longer 64. It does raise to 400. And I state this because this is exactly how it works when you're shooting video in like a log format or even HLG. And so you're going to have to bear this in mind depending on what you're shooting. Now the camera, because it doesn't have a mechanical shutter, does allow you to go up to 1/32,000th of a second. But just know, depending on what you want to do with shutter speed and all this, might require the use of ND filters. It's just something to bear in mind. I think there's a lot of potential in this, however. So as I mentioned, I only had a day with this camera, which also included doing all the B-roll because it's the only access I had. And I only captured a few images for testing purposes, so I promise that when I do a full review on this camera, I will push this even further. Nikon did provide beta software for testing the files, but I want to work more extensively with this. I feel like it has an enormous amount of potential, but right now, Lightroom will read the RAW files, but it processes them in SDR. So time will tell if this is going to be supported down the road, but Nikon's beta version of NX Studio that they sent me does indeed support them. Interestingly enough, as someone who does a lot of camera reviews and a lot of pre-releases, one of my biggest frustrations is that typically Lightroom does not support RAW files for the camera that I'm reviewing because it's not out yet. In fact, many of you probably know that if you purchase a camera right after the release, that it takes about a month or so for Lightroom to actually support things. I'm really happy to announce, though, that other than the HLG RAW thing, the regular RAW files, will read in Lightroom just fine, which is pretty amazing. And the HLG files will read, they just read as SDR files because the software doesn't support it, so you can do all of your editing. So this is really exciting because that means some of you who want to pre-order this camera will have access to RAW files from day one. And it also means that I got to test these RAW files against my own preset packs of classic film simulations. And if you're not familiar with them, these are presets for both Lightroom as well as Capture One, and they are the result of a 2-year project that I spent getting the colors and contrasts of classic film stocks to use with digital cameras. And personally, I love the convenience and versatility of digital cameras, but I've always missed the color interpretation and the contrast that you get with film. And I started by developing emulations of famous Fujifilm stocks that I used to shoot with, such as Natura, Astia Provia, I added Eterna in there, Velvia, and many others, including the Pro C41 films and even the classic Superia. Once I had 16 presets that I absolutely was happy with, I figured why not make simulations for Kodak as well. So this led me to first 6 different Kodachrome simulations. I started with the 1930s formulas all the way up to the last formula that Kodak was using in the 1990s. I also created simulations for various E100, Portra, and even Ektar film stocks. So these are presets that I use in all of my own work, and I decided last year to make them available for anyone who wanted to use them. So if you're interested, I will drop a link in the description below this video. They are on sale for the next week, so if you've been on the fence about these, now is the time to get them. So if you're interested, check it out, and I think you'll dig them. So I do want to reiterate that this is only a preview of the Z8. I just had 1 day of working with the camera. I will definitely do a full review when I've had more time with it. However, I do have some opinions on this camera that I want to share. There are a few pros and cons, but this might be something that will help you determine if this is a camera body that will fit your needs. So overall, this is an incredible offering from Nikon that packs a high level of value for both stills and video shooters. In fact, this camera is actually making me consider Nikon for shooting the videos that I do on this channel. That is something that I never thought I would say. The Z9 was the first time that I saw that this was a real possibility. The Z9 just is it's a large camera. It's a little on the price range where it's like, well, I have a setup that's working here really well right now. Is this something that I want to look at? And the Z8 has actually started to make me think in that direction. The video is outstanding. The files look incredible. The image stabilization, if you want to do some handheld footage, is actually really good as well. And it's just something I'm really impressed with. So I think video is a huge boon for this camera, as it was on the Z9. If we go back to that metaphor of the baby Z9, personally for me, I'm just not a big fan of integrated grip style large cameras. If you are, the Z9 is definitely your best bet. But I think a smaller offering is going to be very appealing to people like me who just prefer a smaller camera. Obviously, those are different opinions. Just know your mileage could vary. Now, like the Z9, this is a very powerful and responsive camera. The only real shooting difference between these two cameras is going to be the battery life. However, Nikon do have an optional grip for the Z8, and you're going to have the option of using that USB-C power delivery also. So there are workarounds. The battery life is decent and it's going to be usable for most. Just know that we're talking about a CEPA rated 275 shots compared to the 700 shots that you're going to be able to take on one Z9 charge. The only real complaint for me, and I know this is going to be super nitpicky, but we're talking about a new generation of mirrorless cameras built around a stacked-CMOS sensor, and Nikon has made the decision on both the Z9 as well as the Z8 to remove the mechanical shutter completely. So it's electronic shutter only. I think it performs extremely well. It's really impressive that it can do that. However, when you take away the mechanical shutter, this leaves the user option with 2 choices. You either have the cartoon shutter sound or you have complete silence with no response from the camera whatsoever. I know this might sound super nitpicky, but as we're moving from objects that were designed as mechanical objects with early cameras, and we're moving into something that's basically solid state. Your phone is solid state. It doesn't have a shutter either, but the phone has a haptic feedback. In other words, you have a sense of touch. When you push the screen, emulating the shutter button, you feel a haptic response. And I wish that Nikon could find a way to do this, even if it's just in the shutter button, something that gives you a response that you are shooting. And especially when you're doing burst rate shooting, it's really foreign if you don't have the little shutter sound on because you don't notice anything. I mean, there's no blackout. It's like the technology in the camera has gotten so good that it creates a secondary problem, which is just the user response to the whole thing. Anyway, that's my only complaint about this camera. I think it's really, it's going to be a really exciting option for Nikon. I think it's probably, between this and the Z9, 2 of the best cameras that they've ever made. Another thing that I want to mention with the Z8 is the price point. So I have a number that Nikon gave me, and I also know that that number is not final, so I don't want to say it. By the time this video comes out, I will know what the final price is, and so I'll put it in the show description below. I do know that a lot of people are going to look at this number and think, well, that's a lot of money for a camera. And look, I agree, it is. I mean, these are not cheap tools. They're expensive, and they're expensive for a reason. But I think you have to look at this in terms of what value you're getting out of it, and you also have to look at it as options if you're a Nikon shooter of what you have in their mirrorless lineup to date. When the Z9 came out, I couldn't believe that it came out at the price point that it did. That price point is lower than any competing camera from other manufacturers in that category, and I think that it just gives you a tremendous amount of value for what you're paying for. I think the Z8 probably gives you even more. When you consider you're getting pretty much all the features of the Z9, different form factor, different price point, but the value went up. And I think that's the reason why I'm so interested in this camera. So I would love to know what you guys think, of course. I'm sure you'll tell me, but leave a comment below, and I'll catch you in the next video. I will follow this up with a full review when I've had some more time with the camera. Thanks again to Nikon for letting me check it out, and I will see you guys in the next video. Until then, later.